So welcome everyone to the kickoff of today's Open Access Australia's activities for Open Access Week. I am Lennox and I'm a member of the Open Access Australasia's Executive Committee. Open Access Australasia acknowledges the First Peoples as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands we know as Australia. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and we honour their enduring connection to the land, waters, community and culture and knowledge that spans over 2,000 generations. We extend this respect to all Indigenous peoples across the region. Open Access Australasia recognises the Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose lands I am working from today. UNSW is our host institution and is located on the traditional lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation in Kensington, Sydney. I'm now going to hand over to Kochi for the karakia.
Kia ora te whānau, nau mai haere mai ki te hui nei, ko ngā te hapani te iwi, ko Yokohama te hau kāinga, ko koi chino e tōku ingoa, e mahi ana hau ki te pātaka kōreo o te herenga waka. He Research Services Librarian ahau, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Koichi Inoue. I'm originally from Yokohama, Japan. I'm a Research Services Librarian at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. I'll begin this panel with a karakia. Karakia is a type of chant. It is a traditional Maori practice to open and close gatherings with a karakia. An opening karakia helps us focus and set a positive tone, while closing karakia clears the space and helps us return to everyday life. So this opening karakia is called Whakataka Te Hau. It literally means seize the wind. It reminds us that while nature's forces can be harsh, by preparing well and responding in harmony, we find peace and balance with both physically and spiritually. So please join me if you happen to know the karakia. Ko tēnei te wā ki te whakatuwhera I tēnei hui. He oe anō ki ai no I tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mākina kia kiuta, kia mātaratara ki tai, e hia ki ana te atakura, he cheo, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei Māori ora. Tūturu whakamaua kia tīna. Huie. Taike. Kia ora everyone. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Anne.
Thanks so much, Kochi. So today's session is being recorded and will be openly available on the Open Access Australia's YouTube channel and website following the session. A quick reminder to please keep your mics mute and keep them muted while our guests are speaking. I am now delighted to hand over to our facilitator for today's panel's discussion, which is Danny Kingsley. Danny has been a key figure and is still a key figure in shaping open access and scholarly communication in both Australia and internationally. Danny is a distinguished leader in scholarly communication and open access, and Danny is currently the Director of Library Services Information at Deakin University and an ambassador for Open End Library. Danny brings deep expertise from her time as a Deputy Director at Cambridge University Libraries, where she led major initiatives in open research and policy development. She has played a pivotal role leading and shaping national and international conversations around open access, including the founding of the Open Access Australasian Strategy Group, which is now Open Access Australasia. We have set up a Q&A where you can post your questions. Our time will be available at the end of the panel discussion to address the questions that you have posted. I'll now hand over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Anne. And good morning, evening or night, depending on where you are currently. Welcome to the Politics of Knowledge, who controls the story and who has access to it. Today's discussion brings together 4 fantastic speakers from North America, Europe, Asia and Australia to explore how government administrations are exerting ownership and control over knowledge, shaping narratives and gatekeeping access. This diverse panel sheds light on the politics shaping knowledge ownership and access in a range of countries, with an emphasis on the ways to defend and reclaim our knowledges in the face of these threats. This is an important discussion and one that will make us reflect and possibly challenge some of our own ideas at times. We come to this discussion in shared mutual respect and thank our panellists for their openness. I'll be introducing each panellist in turn, where they'll talk for about 5 minutes or so about their work from their perspective. We'll then move into a series of questions, which have a shorter time limit of 3 minutes. And while this might seem harsh, we want to have enough time for questions from the audience. We've had over 300 registered people from across the globe, so let's get started. I'll start by introducing Heather Joseph. Heather is the Executive Director of SPARK, an international coalition of academic and research libraries promoting the open sharing of knowledge. Heather.
Thanks so much, Danny. And thank you so much to Open Access Australasia for inviting me to participate in this conversation today. As Danny said, I'm Heather Joseph, pronouns are she and her, Executive Director of SPARK in Washington, D.C., which I want to acknowledge is occupied territory of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people, and I would like to extend my respect to their elders, both past and present. SPARK is really proud to be a founder of Open Access Week, and we really appreciate this year's direct challenge to explore the fundamental question of who owns our knowledge. It's a particularly timely moment to ask this from the US perspective that I hold, given our current social and political turbulence here in the States. It's also a critical opportunity for us to take stock and ensure that we're doing everything we possibly can in our power to protect a bedrock principle of a free society, and also the principle that our work at SPARK is organized around, and that is that sharing knowledge is a human right. We believe that everyone, everywhere, should have the right to contribute to, access, and benefit from the knowledge that shapes our world, and we're far from being alone in taking that approach. That principle is enshrined in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where Article 27 says that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. But as we all know, effectively supporting this principle requires directly answering the question, who owns our knowledge, with the explicit recognition that knowledge itself is a public good and not a commodity. We own our knowledge, and our communities should have the ability and autonomy to control its distribution and its destiny. This, of course, doesn't just happen. It requires consistent, sustained action to assert this on the part of both individual and collective levels, because knowledge sharing is both deeply personal and a collective and communal endeavor. This is really a challenge, I think, for all of us under the best of circumstances, and the US does not, let's be honest, have a particularly strong track record of encouraging community ownership of knowledge from a top-down perspective. The government here has generally approached knowledge ownership from the perspective of individual authorship, not communal or perpetual rights. And this has really hamstrung progress on so many fronts in this country, including protecting Indigenous knowledge, and has stopped the US from adopting and ratifying global frameworks ranging from the Nagoya Protocols to WIPO traditional knowledge instruments. And also right now, frankly, we aren't operating under the best of circumstances in the United States. For us, today marks 9 months since a change in administration here, and we've been experiencing just a flood of politically motivated challenges. And in trying to work to promote the open and equitable sharing of knowledge in the face of daily actions that really cut to the core of our long-held ability to generate, access, and use knowledge. The challenges that we're seeing on a daily basis here from a politically motivated perspective include massive funding cuts that are cutting off individuals' ability to generate and contribute to the knowledge base. Not just cuts to individual small projects, but elimination of funding for entire research areas. We're seeing the large-scale removal and deletion of critical data that affects everything from our public health to our environment, along with the degradation of infrastructure. Critical knowledge platforms we rely on are being steadily taken offline, and those that remain are increasingly suffering from lack of support as we see mass firings continuing even up and through last week. We're also experiencing some top-down executive orders from this administration purporting to support scientific and research integrity, which co-opt the rhetoric of good science and transparency and trade on the appearance of openness to promote a purely political agenda. We're also experiencing interference with academic freedom, from limitations on what individuals can study to campaigns targeting individual academic institutions, threatening their abilities to operate with autonomy or to operate at all. And finally, we're seeing sustained attacks on freedom of speech. Not only questions about what you can study and what you can study, but also down to the level of what words you can use to talk about it. So it's like a daily wrecking ball, right? So much destruction. But it also reinforces the importance and value of what we as individuals and organizations in the ScholComm and open access community do on a daily basis. At Spark, a large part of our work right now in dealing with this onslaught is working with community members to focus on what comes after this wrecking ball of political mayhem finally stops swinging, and working on minimizing the time we spend reacting to each new threat and maximizing the time spent on actions that preserve and protect what we can, and proactively laying foundation pieces for the vision of the knowledge sharing and ownership system we ultimately want. So many of the actions we've identified, which range from policies to practices to infrastructures, share two commonalities. The commonalities that they're centered on the community reasserting local control of intellectual and knowledge outputs, and are also based on shared principles and values that keep us moving towards our shared vision. And just as a very few examples to close, in the face of the restriction and barriers that I just described, we're really emphasizing doing things that have concrete effect in knowledge ownership, from coordinating data and knowledge rescue efforts, creating local archives and mirror sites that document and preserve vulnerable and valuable knowledge. We're doing new things like spinning up cross-institutional networks and new real mutual aid agreements between libraries, universities, research institutions, and funders to share resources and support one another. We're also pooling resources for shared legal support where academic freedom or speech rights are challenged, and creating new secure communication channels to try to initiate secure, rapid collective responses and actions. We're ratcheting up our collective investments in community-owned, decentralized infrastructure that can't easily be shuttered. And while we're definitely taking the approach of working locally as our starting point, we're also prioritizing building connections with our international allies in recognition that, as noted earlier, knowledge sharing is a global endeavor. There's a lot to say about each of these things and many other actions and strategies, but in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it here, and I look forward to unpacking specifics as we dive into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Very powerful words to begin with. Just a reminder to the audience, if you do have questions, the Q&A facility is open and you can put your questions in there. Our next speaker to talk is Professor Sandy O'Sullivan. Sandy is a Wurundjeri transgender non-binary scholar, a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, where they also work in the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. Sandy.
Thank you so much. I'm actually Wiradjuri. A lot of people who spend time in Melbourne get it confused with Wurundjeri. That's okay. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me to speak. What I want to do is to show you around a little bit of a site, but it's kind of in some ways to respond and build on the discussion that Heather just kicked off there. We're really concerned in terms of broadly what's happening with not just Indigenous knowledge as sovereignty and data sovereignty, but the process of mining that information that comes with some substantial risks when things are freely available as well. So there's a tension around this that I think is important to understand. And this "we own our knowledge" is a contingent factor in understanding who owns it. You know, is it everyone or is it us? And how are those restrictions set? So I think just to, again, end point before I share screen, this idea of learning from us about what happens if there isn't an after is really important, because we don't live in an after. We live in a present tense of colonialism. And so learning how to deal with something that may not end is actually something that that everyone can learn from the way that that we as Indigenous peoples internationally have managed, I guess. So I'm just going to share screen so that you can look at some of the work. I'm just going to kick off with this, which is our Queer As project. Now, I've been funded for the last 5 years to do work on an ARC, Australian Research Council, Saving Lives, mapping the influence of LGBTIQA plus Indigenous artists and creative practitioners. There's been a lot of work that's come out of this, but there's also been a lot of risk that's come out of it in relation to ideas of what open access means. And I thought it was really important to share this today. I can't be global about what happens for trans people. I can't be global about what happens for Indigenous people. And I definitely can't be global for what happens to queer in relation to knowledge sharing from queer Indigenous peoples. But we've had to nut out some really thorny issues. So the first thing that happens time and time again, but it kicked off when we began our program, was, you know, I'm here on Darug, this remarkable country that I'm in at the moment. I'm a Wiradjuri person from another part of the country, fairly nearby, and we have multiple communities that we engage with, because of course we do. And we also find that the work that we're doing as queer Indigenous people who are writing scholarly work is often forgotten. I'd argue sometimes intentionally and sometimes just because it's not on people's radar, by queer academics. And there's a lot of discussion, and this is what we started with, a lot of queer non-Indigenous academics saying, yes, but there's not really any writing on queer indigeneity, or there's very little. So the first thing that we did was, as you can see, came up with a list that defies that. This is one of 7 pages, so it gives you some sense that it's maybe not completely true. And this is, again, thinking about work that spans the disciplines, that is variously accessible, but is framed in very different ways within these broader academic silos. And so it presents problems for us effectively. Now, just so that I can cover off on this in the time that we have, the Queer As site obviously focuses on queer Indigenous artists, and we do have art on here. However, we've also avoided having art because of the potential for mining, the extractive process, particularly for Indigenous art, of grabbing material. And so the process becomes going back to artists, going back to how they can frame and protect their own work and how they can shape the conversations about their work. Obviously, we've got podcasts and we've got material that does include their artwork, but that's within a very close confine of discussion. And so I wanted to mention that. And just as I'm finishing up, I also wanted to, stop share again, just so that, I just wanted to mention some of where this came from. Back in 2020, there had been a question around whether there were any Indigenous academics who are writing into people's discipline areas. And apologies for the terrible foreground. I don't have control over AusLit, but this is the publicly available AusLit 101 list of Black writers, so Indigenous Australian writers who are writing. The majority of these are open access. The majority of the other ones that we put up are open access, but we make a distinction when they're not and when they are. So again, one of the kind of key issues as I scroll through this, so what had happened at the beginning of the time was that on X, Twitter at the time, and on a whole lot of social media, people were saying, there is no Aboriginal person who publishes into my discipline. And it wasn't true. They just didn't know it. And they didn't know the people. And so this was really giving people a springboard. It was always one person, one publication. And so we did that strategically so that people could then go off and find other publications. And I mentioned this as part of the process of discussion here, because this idea of not being able to discover something is absolutely typical in a retractive way of considering Indigenous people and Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous engagement in the academy and Indigenous engagement in publishing. And so part of what has to happen is a more expansive view. It's pretty simple, but we think that it requires training wheels. That's why we've, provided some more information. We've provided information about queer Indigenous artists, surprisingly through surveys that we've run, and we've run multiple large form surveys on this. It's surprising, lots of people just don't know. So again, this is to say you probably do know, but if you don't, here's a list. You probably can find, but you'll also find that we're frequently publishing into edited volumes. At the moment, that often means that they're not open access, as you know. And so this, particularly in academic context, we're often publishing together, which means that it's in that form. And so there are instances where, I'll just finish off by showing this. So there are instances where we have some very specific problems around these issues of access and discoverability. But discoverability is a colonial context. It is the colonial project writ large to be able to push people into the disciplines that they exist in. And so, in other words, almost everything that we're doing is busting out of this. And I think you'll see that Indigenous data sovereignty is working on a pivot point of this process of discoverability and this process of sometimes you don't have access and you shouldn't have access. So yeah, thank you. Sorry about it being just a complete blurt out of this, but I think it's really important that we understand some of the complications around making information visible, but also on what it means to set up spaces that that stop that mining being disconnected from people and from communities. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. That's really, really interesting, that push and pull between those two kind of perspectives. Our next speaker is Dr. Encia Afani. Encia is a researcher currently at the Perimeter Institute in Canada. So Encia, off you go.
So hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Danny, for introduction, and also thanks for the open access to give me this chance to be here with you. So let me just share the screens. So I just wanted to let you know that wherever I'm based now in Canada, it's just still October 20th. So you're just one day behind you. So just about me, I have a background in physics. I do cosmology in general, and I also, I don't know why the slides are going by themselves. Just give me a minute. Maybe I should share it again. To not allow it to go by itself. Okay. So I'm originally from Iran, now living in Canada, but I'm also the exiled scholar since September 2022, which if I get the time, I will come back to that. And I'm also the human rights activist from September 2022 because of the actions that I did for the human life freedom in my country. So actually, I wanted to share you some really exceptional case in the case of the Iran, because we know that it is one of the countries which we call the system is the totalitarian regimes. And I just wanted to share with you that how in these kind of the systems, knowledge is accessible for all or not, and how the scientists and scholars, even the public, facing about the open knowledge that they have. Unfortunately, in these systems, knowledge is a political capital, and controlling, it means that controlling minds, narrative, and also the future generations as well. Who is allowed to produce, share, and even access knowledge is the main question in these systems, because even having access to knowledge and information is not allowed for all people. So in these systems like Iran, access and ownership of the knowledge are tightly controlled by your gender, religion, ethnicity, and also your language. And I will go to the details about that. So, for example, in the case of gender in Iran, women are really limited access to the certain academic fields. Even going to the school is allowed if you're just having the compulsory hijab. So without having the hijab, you will not be able to do the education. So that means that you have a restricted leadership and participation in the society. And as I mentioned, you should have a specific dress code to be able to have access to any knowledge, even from the elementary school. Unfortunately, LGBTQ individuals, they are not recognized by law. So you can imagine that if you are not recognized by law, how you are limited to have an access for the education or whatever as a human being in the society. And facing the exclusion from the education is part of that. And in Iran, the education system, especially schools, and sometimes in some specific universities, are gender segregated. Means that if you are part of the LGBTQ, so you should just define yourself women or men, otherwise you will not be able to continue your education. So that's what you face regarding your gender. So gender determines who allows to access to the knowledge. In the case of the religion, of course, most of the majorities in Iran are Muslims, and they are related to Shia Muslims, which is also dominated by educational institutions. The other kind of the religion, for example, Sunnis, Christianity, and even Jewish, they face the discrimination. And non-confronting religions or secular individuals face more discrimination and exclusion. For example, Baha'i students, they are banned from going to the university. So it's not written by the law that they are not allowed, but unfortunately, when they pass the entrance exam for the university, they realize that they don't have access to enter. So although it is not part of the law, but unfortunately, the regime also putting such pressures for the religions that it's not defined by them. So, of course, the religion also confronts requirement to the academic position and also for the jobs worldwide. So you cannot see in the faculty members really few Sunnis or few Christians. And the Jewish, I think, is almost nobody included in this kind of the high positions. So state ideology defines acceptable knowledge. So faiths determine who can study, teach, or even publish. In the case of the ethnicity and languages in Iran, they are really related to each other because among the population of the country that is almost 90 million, almost 78% of the ones who are speaking Persian, 10 millions that they are after the Persians when they are from the Azeri ethnicity, which I belong also to that one. So we speak Azeri at home, and that's our mother language. But unfortunately, due to the rules of the regime, we never learned at school how to read and write our mother language. So that is how we are banned also as our ethnicity to have an access to the knowledge. So this means that these minorities of the ethnicity and language, including Kurdish, Azeri, Baluchi, Arabic, and Turkmen, and other bands from the formal instruction. So the official language of the education is Persian. And if as a kid you don't learn that language, this means that you don't have access to the knowledge. So for the kids that they start the school at the age of 6, 7, it's really sometimes complicated for them to understand the language that they didn't grow up for that, especially in the really rural regions. So the language, which comes from your ethnicity, most of the places bans you from having the equal access to the education. So scholars using local languages face censorship and exclusion, and there is no even publications that you can do it in your own language. So these are the pressures that you're facing regarding the categorized by the government inside of the system. But unfortunately, since Iran is one of the countries which is a totalitarian regime, unfortunately, we also have a less limit to the internet. And of course, that also bans us for having access to the scientific journals and websites and the platforms. And I can just give you any statistics that Iran is the 97th country among of the 100 countries that they have internet quality. So imagine how the situation is terrible there. And apart from all the limitations by the government that bans you to receive the open access to the knowledge, scholars also face sanctions and isolation, which is also because of the political behavior of the regime. And Iranian academics, they don't have access to the journals because for the many publications, you need to pay to have an access for that. And because of the bank sanctions, Iran cannot pay for that. So you don't have an access for it. Even if you want to publish in such kind of journals, you cannot pay the registration fee because you don't have a bank account in general. And even the access for the softwares and research tools, almost all banned. Even you cannot even imagine that even the Zoom is blocked in Iran. So you need to have the VPN to have an access to that. So all of these social accesses and even the public platforms for learning knowledge, for example, like Coursera, are limited for Iranians. So you cannot have an access. Even if you participate in the courses with VPN, you cannot get your certificate because you should mention about your nationality, which your country is banned from them. So there are also financial barriers as well because of the economical situations and also because of the banks and sanctions. You're not able to pay for your open access publications fees, conference registration, or membership in many societies in general. And all these sanctions also face you with the travel restrictions. As a scholar, the visa denials is really common for Iranians, even if you have a dual nationality. It is still the case. For example, I have several friends that they have a dual nationalities and they have a second passport, but traveling to some countries like US is not allowed for them anymore. Of course, this means that you will not also have an access to equipment and materials, whatever is related to the labs or to new technologies or whatever that can have a dual usage in military or other stuffs. So in summary, I can just say that, okay, in totalitarian system, the question who owns our knowledge is not just metaphorical, it's just a literal concept for us. The state owns it, and to make knowledge free, you must make the people first free. And the pressure is unfortunately from inside and also from outside with all the restrictions that we have. And all of us know that open access must begin with open minds. And unfortunately, we have these limited minds with our authorities inside the country, and also the closed minds that they don't give open access to the science and knowledge for the countries, for the people of the countries that they are under the totalitarian regimes. And what is the solution? At least we tried to make and establish the international community of the Iranian academics in 2022 after this uprising of women life freedom, because we realized that nobody is the voice of the Iranian scholars, that they are under suppression and the severe violation of academic freedom. And we made this organization to report what's happening inside of the countries and how many students and faculty members have been detained, lost their right for education, and having the communication with human rights organizations as well, and also making the community of the Iranian community, scientists and scholars in diaspora, to give them a voice and try to facilitate some of the problems that we are facing as the Iranian scholars in diaspora, which also affects us as a scientist that we are working outside of the country as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Ensia, for that explanation of the situation for scholars in Iran. Now we're moving on to Ksenia Leventieva. Ksenia is a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter Law School, specialising in the socio-legal governance of digital heritage and cultural relevant data. Just like to point out that it is also the middle of the night, and we very much appreciate you staying up for us. So off you go, Ksenia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your introduction. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, I will share my screen. Hopefully it will be okay. Can you see it?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So it's an honor to be here, to be honest, and to present my paper that I published earlier this year in May. And what I did in my research, I basically compare Russian state policies before 2022 and after 2022, after Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So when we talk about changes after 2022, I think like many people probably know that there is a state censorship, there is like official ideology, and in terms of data and access to data before 2022, I would say that Russia was a pretty ordinary state in terms of heritage data and state-related data. And there was at least couple of attempts to provide open access to cultural data and state-related data, but it's all finished after full-scale invasion. Similarly, with critical perspective on colonialism, gender, war in Ukraine, it's totally banned nowadays. And as my specialty, is digital heritage and access. What is really important to my research is that after 2022, there is an official state policy and there is an official aim to create a unified digital knowledge space for all archives, libraries, and museums in Russia. And what is also very important, that the information in this unified digital knowledge space should align with traditional Russian values, namely service to fatherland, the heteronormative family, orthodoxy, collectivism, and so on. And access to cultural heritage is framed as a tool to foster patriotism, similarly to the museums and their role, which is also framed as a way to rise a new generation in accordance with Russian traditional values and Russian history. And also there is an official ideology. It's kind of spread all across legislation and different president decrees. But I think what is crucial in terms of, in relation to Ukraine, that in this official ideology, it's kind of, it's very obvious that the Russian language and Slavic Russian culture play a crucial unifying role, meaning that all other ethnic minorities or other cultures or histories, like from Ukraine or from Belarus, they are erased from heritage and they erased from culture. And after Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia appropriated thousands and thousands museum objects from Ukraine, and they basically, like Russian army, put it like in Crimea or in other part of occupied territories. And speaking of like controlling knowledge, what they did, because there is official ideology and there is understanding of access to knowledge as a way to promote the state ideology, when they represent, for example, the heritage of Crimean Tatars, who are Muslim and who belong to very different cultural tradition compared to Russia or Ukraine, that they reinterpret their heritage and they put the whole history of Crimea in very European and Christian way, completely erasing the identity of Crimean Tatars and Muslims. Similarly, there is like very blunt ideology, like the unified digital Russian space is filled with various museum exhibition, 3D tours that represent the occupied territories as Russian historically and culturally. Another bit, what is going on here in the digital environment is that they create museums. It's like interactive museums, so you can there are like museums in the physical space as well as in the digital space. And I was trying to find a very striking example, like how ideology really influenced the framing of narratives and knowledge. And you can see like this is the Museum of Special Military Operation. Basically, it's like the Museum of Russian occupation. And you can see that like in this exhibit, the trophy is the Ukrainian text on the history. It's like it's a historian textbook is portrayed as a trophy because the whole idea of occupation is a link to rewriting the history of Ukraine. And what is important in terms of the digital environment, when like before, if you want to create a museum, you need a space, you need like a physical space, and you need objects, you need like real objects. With the military, with the museums of occupation, because of the technologies and because of the digital space, what the digital environment really allows, it's to very easy way to disseminate this knowledge and to disseminate these narratives. Like basically you can see like there is a website and you can order your own museum. Because it's all online, it's all like in the digital space, you can just put like hardware and you have all the information outright. Similarly, because of the digital environment opportunities that, for example, there is this is the exhibition that was created in 2014. And I've counted that this particular so-called exhibition is replicated with almost every museum on the occupied territories, as well as in the Russian museums, for every event that's slightly related to children rights, war, and so on and so forth. So like they're very, very different events. They're like very, very different museums. But because of like the digital environment really allows to create and maintain like the same narrative. And speaking, I'm trying to be as fast as possible. Speaking of access to data and how open access is important. For example, there is still the state catalog. It's the database of all museums objects in Russia. And all data here, except images, are granted under open license. But what is really important, that you cannot access it outside Russia. So like the open access itself, like the license of open access that allow you to use and reuse the data, it's actually meaningless if behind the open access, behind the infrastructure, there is a very powerful stakeholder who has this opportunity to exclude others. And it's not with state catalogs, a lot of museum websites, they also not accessible from outside the Russia. And lastly, I want to say about the copyright and the museum legislation, because, you know, it's not only about Russia, because like this is a very common strategy across museum libraries and archives. When the museums, they claim copyright or like very specific museum rules to exclude others from using and reusing images. And like the Hermitage Museum before invasion, the Hermitage Museum denied a company that produces mattresses from using this image because of like aesthetic reasons, right? And when there was I made an argument, this is a censorship. Like the museum is not here to decide how to use and reuse the images and paintings. There is still how to put it nicely, there is still the idea that museum can be a guardian. But in Russian context, when you think about the copyright and when you think about these specific museum policies, you can see how the copyright can be a really tool of censorship, even like the self-censorship. Because, for example, if I want to, like, if I'm writing a dissertation and I want to use this painting, it means that I have to have a written permission from the Hermitage Museum. And let's say, like, and when I have to ask the written permission, I have to explain what is my research about, where I'm writing this research, what are my research questions, who is supervising my research. So let's imagine that I'm writing research on LGBTQ rights in Russia and I want to use the visual and paintings, right? I would be denied. And this, like beyond the very obvious and open ways how Russia control dissemination of knowledge and how Russia maintains these narratives of colonization, there are also these like subtle ways that exist beyond Russia as well, like for example, in the UK. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please reach me out.
Wow, thank you very much, Ksenia. And we've got some queries to any queries that you want, any questions, can you put into the Q&A, which we can then pick up in the discussion. So what an amazing start. 4 very different and they're all very concerning perspectives in terms of the discussion around politics and knowledge in different ways. And we've got these questions in Iran and Ukraine quite specifically discussions around language and how central that is to inclusion or otherwise. However, the question of language obviously is very present in current events in the US and is an ongoing issue for Indigenous peoples. And so in all cases, the ability to participate in knowledge production and consumption is being challenged. So let's move to some specific questions around the politics of knowledge. And we're going to go back to Ksenia again. And my question of you is, the seizure and reframing of cultural heritage is a stark example of knowledge being weaponised. What are the risks when collections are displaced or re-narrated under occupation? And what strategies exist to reclaim or assert ownership of cultural knowledge in these contexts?
Thank you so much for this question. I think like the main fear and the main consequences that we have, that for example, if you just Google Russian studies, Slavic studies in the well-established Western universities, for example, in Australia or in the UK, and you look through like their guidance, what are the sources of information available, it will be predominantly Russian sources. So still the Hermitage Museum, the Russian museums, they still consider as like trustworthy resources where you can gain a lot of information. And it's really difficult to tackle this because there are not many alternatives to this. There are some alternatives like from like different countries, but as an alternative to the Russian narratives that have been created not after 2022, but rather like through the whole Soviet Union times and Russian Empire times, there are like very little critical understanding how biased these resources are. And this is the one very big problem. And I think another very big problem that how difficult is to oppose it and how difficult is to dismantle them. Because after Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a big push of renaming and reclaiming Ukrainian artists and painters, for example. And here in the UK, there is a Tate Museum, and they have some paintings of Malevich, who was always portrayed as a Russian one, but he's actually Ukrainian. And when he was in the museum, they put an explanation, like a big biography of Malevich, and that actually he was raised in Ukraine, it was influenced by Ukrainian art, and so on and so forth. But when you go to the Tate Museum website, it still has like Malevich is a Russian painter. And when you go to the source, like how the Tate Museum, like where Tate Museum got this information, it's from Wikipedia. And you go to Wikipedia and you look to the sources, how Wikipedia took this statement, it's mainly Russian museums. So when we see the digital space as this, like the space of opportunities, like the space where we can reclaim our knowledge, recreate narratives, it's actually very, very difficult, and it requires tremendous efforts, and it requires infrastructure, it requires material resources, and it requires the political will from the West as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Encia, can I turn to you? Exclusionary state policies often regulate who can access education or contribute to science. How does this restriction shape what knowledge gets created or suppressed? And what grassroots or collective initiatives have you seen to resisting these controls?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, actually, that also leads to the brain drain in the country, actually. So Iran, regarding the population, is more or less the first country of the brain drain. Although there is no war, there is no visible conflict that one can really see it. And unfortunately, in 47 years that the regime has changed in 1979. So we really faced a really great brain drain in the country, especially at the beginning of the revolution, that they closed the universities for 3 years with the name that we want to have the cultural revolution, apart from the political revolution that they had. So the cultural revolution means that they wanted to make everything in the universities relate to the Islam. And of course, they banned many scholars that they had a different, political orientation, on their different religion, different ethnicity. So it was a really complicated situation that at that time, almost half of the faculty members of the Iran have been expelled. They just forced to stay at home or just leaving the country, so they never had an access to come back to universities. And some of the subjects completely removed from the universities of Iran, especially in the social sciences. So it was really complicated situations, but in any totalitarian regime also, once they face that, okay, they need a progress in their own needs. For example, they need a progress because not many of the countries, they are sharing the knowledge with them because they're really worried about how they are going to use this knowledge. So that's why they realized that they really need to train the scientists. So I started the PhD program in Iran, which was really difficult, especially in the basic sciences, that we didn't have such kind of the scholars anymore. So it was difficult, but they made it. So, but they didn't realize that, okay, these scholars and students will make a problem for them because, of course, when the people have a right to think, they have also right to also ask the questions. And some of these questions could be really critical. And it could be against the definition of the academic freedom that the government had in its mind. But the point is that you cannot always also delete the curiosity of the people. So the people find, especially the young generation, they find that the only way that they can have a freedom, especially for females, just having the university education. So they try to enter to the universities to gain the knowledge. And even they have an access to leave the country to contribute more. And of course, although with all these restrictions that we have, even collaborating with our colleagues inside the country, they face these risks to collaborate with their scientists, accepting these students from Iran as their own students. So that's how they share the knowledge in a really indirect way, because there is no really path that the governments or the other countries helps us to really collaborate with our scientists inside. The point is that science has no borders and also always transcends the borders, whatever is that border. It could be ideological border that you are facing with that. So this is the resistance that we really try to gain the knowledge, but unfortunately, when it comes to the application of this knowledge and science to innovation and technology, we are limited with that, because especially with these world that is approaching to really well advanced technology and knowledge, we don't have an access to that. And if it continues like this, it will face a big problem in future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting, that question around academic freedom. And what does that, I'm not sure there's a universal understanding of that, and certainly not in people's experience. Interesting to bring that up. Sandy, I'll turn to you now. Your recent work highlights how colonial projects of gender intersect with knowledge production. How does the colonial state continue to regulate Indigenous identities and knowledges? And what does an Indigenous-led reclaiming of knowledge sovereignty look like in practice?
I wish I knew. I'm sorry. I've known that you were going to ask this question, so I say that as a kind of global response as well. It's really hard. Obviously, the work I've been doing and that we've been doing as a team is on challenging the colonial project of gender as this container that doesn't, and it's gender, sexuality, and everything else. It's this reductive way that Indigenous people are regarded, but it's not reflective of the way that we contribute to the world. In so-called Australia, we have this idea of closing the gap. That is the gap between non-Indigenous people's lives, expectations from the state, and health and well-being, and between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, it's it's absolutely outrageously disparity. But what's never there is this idea of what happens when we exceed the gap, when we're doing work that actually should be regarded and that allows a more expansive view, or when actually the gap's not the point and we're doing work over here. And so some of it is the systems, and this is our tricky problem when we work in areas like open access, is to work against the systems while we're building the systems. And so understanding that those containers were these colonial structures that stopped any kind of complexity from being around is part of what happens when you have more people who are Indigenous, who are writing into these spaces, who are making work. Knowledge production more broadly is hard because it's not just in universities, of course, and certainly it shouldn't be. It's across all of our public sphere, and it's across all of our private sphere as well. And so what needs to be presented to others and what can be presented to others is often has restrictions. And we're talking about tens of thousands of communities, not just tens of thousands of people. You know, we're talking about thousands of communities around the world that have very different ways of thinking and being, and are often reduced into, particularly by systems, into this idea of what it means to be. And, you know, so this is one of the challenges in, you know, supporting Indigenous data sovereignty, is not just replacing an existing system with one that just does something different, but for Indigenous people. And of course, we've got wonderful people who are working across that area. I get to work with Yanti Ropian, I get to work with Rose Barracliff. You know, we work with people who are doing remarkable work across these spaces, but you know, the resistances are there often by people who are using the resources. And so the resistance is something that we present, you know, like the earlier presentation on this, that we present to our colleagues, and just to say, stop reducing us, you know that we are more than, yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question about when you were saying about different people producing knowledge, about even what counts as knowledge.
Yeah. The idea of what counts as knowledge, I think, is something that is not asked. You know, we know that the Academy is not sure of this. You know, it goes through these cycles. In fact, the Australian government about 10 years ago, no, it was a bit more than that now, when they were doing some of the early era stuff into the second and third era, had to produce something that said what research was. And it was not the understanding that we all knew. You know, it was actually a kind of a more global statement. And so even these ideas of when we are mining information at different times, what we need out of it changes. And, you know, and obviously for communities, what they need out of it is different than for instance, the Academy or government. But they also, you know, there is an understanding, we know as community members, that those spaces are going to often be the authority and the authoritative voices. And so the work that we're doing about shifting that and saying, actually, we write into these spaces, other people don't just write about us, becomes important.
Yeah, really interesting. Heather, we come back to Heather, who's started us off. We often celebrate policy wins like open access mandates, but these still are resting on state and funder frameworks. So how do we prevent sort of open, in inverted commas, infrastructures from becoming just another form of government managed knowledge gatekeeping?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think it's something that we're struggling with here now, you know, really looking at the outcomes of things like the national open access mandate here in the US, which is supposed to go into effect at the end of this year on December 31st. And whether it will or won't is still, I think, you know, quite a bit up in the air, mainly because of the tension of how it's what infrastructure it depends on in order to be implemented. And we fought very hard at our organization for the infrastructure for implementation to be distributed, community-owned, community-run, repository-based, distributed, non-centralized infrastructure. There's an element to that in the implementation that's coming down the pike, but it wasn't 100% embraced by the community of researchers here in the US, certainly not the publishing community, and definitely not by institutions sort of writ large. So I think, you know, we can look at the kinds of characteristics that implementation structures and infrastructures need to have, that, you know, beginning with what I just sort of started to describe, that we need, non-centralized, decentralized platforms, shared protocols for interoperability, easy migration, low switching costs, all those kinds of technical issues. But I think the reality is we need to get more buy-in in terms of community infrastructure being quality infrastructure. And one of the things we've been looking at is the example that things like preprint servers in the academic space, the kind of model of community-run, community-driven, and owned, distributed yet potentially interoperable systems, maybe give us a little bit of a roadmap for things that we should be looking towards. But it's a really thorny question at this moment.
Yes, and given that the internet initially, the whole point of it was that it was the idea was that it was the ultimate distributed thing, so that if one area went down, it was backed up. Not using that language, but in lots of other places, it seems sort of ironic that we've ended up where we are. I'm going to come back to that question of authority of voice and think about the idea about the issue of language. And so, if we think about English as a dominant language in global publishing, how does this shape what knowledge gets visibility and what remains marginal? And I guess a subsequent question of that is, should open access include a commitment to linguistic diversity? Ansia, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, in the case of Iran, even having the access to English is not really easy because of all these limitations that we have. Even I just remember when I was a bachelor student, I wanted to have an access to the original copy of the books. I couldn't even find in the libraries of the university because we had the limited resources because of the political and also economical issues. So most of the time we were using the resource in a really illegal way, copying them or printing them. So we never had the right, laws of the copyright there. So that's how we just use it. So it was also the bad point for the country also, because when we want also to share also knowledge also, since we did not obey copyright, of course, the others also, they don't obey as well too. But that was the only way that we could have access to the information. And later, regarding the journals, as I mentioned to you, many journals, because of the sanctions, they don't cooperate with Iranians. So having access to them, even if you be able to pay for it with all these, ways of the turning around the sanctions and paying that, it's impossible. I can even share with you that a few months ago, I sent my article to the journal that most of my papers have been published there. And the day after sending the journal, I received from the editor that your paper is not suitable for our journal. I was just surprised at what happened. And then I realized that, okay, one of my co-authors is from Iran, from a university which is under sanctions. And that's the reason. After several follow-ups with the editor and even with the editor-chief of that journal, I didn't receive any reply. And months later, I also wanted to send also another article to pre-review. And I really wanted to ban that journal anymore, and I never published it. I said, okay, let's try to see that, am I really right that it is because of the sanction or there is another reason? I sent it to that journal again. Of course, this time there was no co-author from Iranian affiliation, and it has been accepted to get peer-reviewed. And I just get wondered that, same topic, same things with different co-authors, just the only one is from Iran. Of course, the reason is sanctions, but unfortunately, when there is even no open access for the knowledge, even in English, unfortunately, the publishers and community, they don't accept that this is their policy. And I'm always wondering that if whatever it is right, accept it. If it is wrong, say that, okay, because of all these limitations, we cannot accept it. But why in the scientific community you are behaving like that? So imagine that as a person who is living in diaspora, even in exile, because you were against the regime and you want to really collaborate with your colleagues inside and sharing the knowledge, helping them, you really realize that you cannot do it. And of course, I cannot blame the other colleagues that they don't have Iranian nationality to collaborate with Iranian people, or even with the countries that they are under sanctions. So the issue is really, really complicated. Even in my country, studying English, it was forbidden at the beginning of the revolution. So at the schools, you never learned English. So you will learn Arabic, but not English. So it just takes the time, years and years, that you realize, okay, English is the international language. You cannot avoid it. So it is only English or Arabic, and of course we never use Arabic because we don't publish it with that. We don't speak it just in some part of the Iran. The Arab language is the language, local language. So the other languages are completely removed. Even learning French or Spanish or these common languages that many people also speak. So the limitation comes from the ideology that Arabic is a lot because it's related to the language of the Quran, but the other languages, they even considered as, foreign language, as Western language, that you are not really even allowed to have an access. So you even see that many Iranian politicians in high level, they cannot even speak English very well. So I'm just always wondering that, okay, the limitation is everywhere. So if you learn any language just because you realize that you should learn it, it's not with the path of the governments that helps you to progress in that language. So you always need to go to the schools of the language to learn it. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, in Iran, finding English language schools is much easier than finding your local language. For example, if I want to learn Azeri well, in a way that I will be able to read and write because it is my mother language, there is no classes. And it's also forbidden to have it. So the communities try to make these languages and make the courses and schools, but it was forbidden. So imagine that how the limitation exists. So imagine how you can publish in the other issue. So the language barrier, even speaking your mother language, is a restriction because even in the universities that they are the local universities that people speak in that language, doing it in your local language is not allowed. And even if you want to teach in English in the university, saying that you really want to improve the English of my students to give them an access, it's not allowed by the rules. So you can do it, but the university can forbid you for doing it. So having an access even to English is really, really limited.
Thank you. Ksenia, what's your sort of perspective on this question of English being the sort of lingua franca?
I will be very quick. So I think one of the biggest problem that I face, that basically in order to have access to any decolonial perspective or any work, it's not the global south doesn't actually speak with each other, like global south countries. So it's always through English. I have access to, for example, Latin American writers, right? And their perspective. Same with African perspective and writers. It's through only through the English language I can have access to this concept. And I think it's really frustrating. I do not know what is the way out, but I think it's really important to understand that English and we all know that the language is actually frame how we understand world, how we ask research questions, right? It's really define how we think about the world. So when you think about decolonial thought, broadly speaking, and it's only in English, it's very, very bizarre. That's all.
That's really interesting, that concept of the way you think about the world. Sandy, I'm sure that you, from an Indigenous perspective, you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, there's a few things. One is the sort of contestation of the global south, which doesn't really understand colonisation in an even way because of the kind of rendering of what constitutes the global south. So, for instance, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are not rendered into that, in spite of the fact that in every other way, so there's already some linguistic trickery that happens around the way that people are included or excluded in that space. I think there's these reductive hierarchies that are set up in terms of language. And one of the things that we see time and time again is the way that in linguistic contexts, thinking about the languages, 300 plus languages for people who don't know in so-called Australia. And, this notion of languages somehow being able to be written down and known and understood, and then this idea of what happens if it's what's framed as an incomplete language, and then the discussion of language loss rather than language being taken. So the kind of, just strategic issues around that. But there's this really fundamental problem that we've had, and that's that the way that words, names, even our names, Wiradjuri, for instance, is a really good example. The way that Wiradjuri is written by us which is variously, we all use different ones, is seen as inconsistent by others. And so we had the instance just recently where one of my colleagues who was writing about me, just in brief, and had said Wiradjuri and had spelt it the way that I do, had a non-Indigenous peer review come back and tell them off that Wiradjuri people don't use those terms. Now, they could have done a word search, a person search on me and seen that I did. I write it enough, but of course they had to be right. So this notion of being right in terms of language and linguistics is a fundamental translation issue. So when you've got it happening in relation to something that's really simple in terms of translation, of course, when it comes to a greater complexity around differences and ways of being, it really doesn't come through. So we have, Yinamara Winangara, we've got this concept of making the world a better place by being in it, we use it in our work, so it's a Wiradjuri idea, but I don't even know how to say idea or term or any of these things, and I don't want to translate it into English because it means something else. And we all of us who have linguistic diversity know that it's not just a translation. And yet, this kind of funneling that happens is the same as the broader colonial project and strictures of the container. Anything that falls outside of it isn't considered, and is taken, not lost. Yeah, that.
Fascinating. Heather, as somebody who comes from a country that predominantly speaks English, language is being used and changed in the space that you're in, and so within the that context of sort of how science is operating and how openness is operating, what are you seeing? What's sort of happening in that question of language for you?
Well, I mean, I think what's happening on the ground here in the US, I'm going to leave aside and maybe address it in another question, but the idea of translation, Sandy, what you were just saying really resonates to me as an activist in the open access space for the last 20 years. And the farthest I've gotten in terms of making any concrete progress towards embracing multilingualism is to put, give a nod to the notion of bibliodiversity should be centered in models like Diamond Open Access. But when we talk about it, the commitment is generally, I think, just completely accepted or expected to be that the commitment to bibliodiversity and multilingualism will start with English and then translation will be provided into English instead of starting from a different language perspective and translating, out from that. And I don't know how we can stop this kind of cycle from happening. We have an opportunity as we're having conversations about models that are really community driven, like these institutional based Diamond models, but I think the OA community really doesn't understand how to center other languages in the system. And until we do that, we're stuck. And I think that is something that we have to face head on right now.
Okay, so if we pick up that sort of question around that participation question. So we often open access, and this comes down to sort of who owns our knowledge, is often framed as a democratizing force in that, if material is openly available, then it is able to be, let's not go into the question about whether it's actually readable, but if it's available, then it's more democratic. However, if the mechanism to make research openly available is the pay to publish model, that brings in all sorts of other queries and questions around who gets to participate in the discourse. So we're just shifting that movement there. So Ksenia, have you got a sort of view on this?
I think it's very important to understand that if something available, it doesn't mean that it's automatically good, because we know that the digital environment really just reproduce all the epistemic violence, and you have to be really careful when you have access to any information. Having said that, I also want to highlight that there are a lot of different ways of resistance. And sometimes having access and having something online can be really, really crucial. As a scholar from Russia, when I did my research proposal for the scholarship, for example, I used this, like Telegram chat when you can ask to provide you an article, and your colleagues from like Western universities can really share, they can download and share this article with you. The same way, like, for example, if we compare a situation with Soviet Union, when it was not possible to have access to archives, and it's still the situation, like it's very difficult to get access to the archives, to museum collections fund, and this kind of stuff. And having at least something online can really be helpful in terms of like reclaiming this knowledge and to create your own stories and create your own narratives. So I would say that the digital space provide agency, and we have to be mindful that agency is not equal power. So we have to be mindful about like this context, but to deny completely that the access and the digital environment is not really beneficial, it is like, but it's like the benefits is really limited. Thank you.
What do you think, Sandy, in terms of this question about open access being a democratizing force, but maybe not?
Look, I think it is, but it's really funny again. A lot of Indigenous people, I mean, I've been an academic for nearly 35 years, but I'm in the first wave of Aboriginal people who went through, like a lot of people my age, I left school very young at 13. And, so this is, and I'm obviously turning 60 next year, so, I mean, what we're finding with Indigenous academics, as an example, writing into these spaces. And again, this is not just about, Indigenous people, but let's say, and it's not just about scholars, but what we've done is that we've played catch up remarkably, like with the sheer volume of work that Indigenous people are producing is enormous. But we haven't always had access to it being in open access because we cross over disciplines. We're often, for instance, just thinking about literal open access in terms of journals or books or whatever, is we've had, that opportunity that's come through from academic publishers that almost, to the academic publisher don't have open access as part of, in fact, they have the opposite of open access, they have highly restricted access. And so what we've seen is when people are writing together because they cross over multiple disciplines, critical Indigenous studies might be something like 30 disciplines, but Indigenous studies more broadly is something like every discipline, like all your disciplines are our disciplines. And so the opportunity to publish together is often not within the standard journals that even have that kind of open access. And so that's what we've seen. So there's a number of wonderful edited volumes that have come out that cost $400 US to access them. And so they're restricted in that way, but we understand why. But does the general public understand why? Does, a community member who says, look, I spoke to you and that's not, I can't see that at all. I don't have access to that. Do they understand that? I work with museums. Does a museum that doesn't have access to that kind of understand that as well? And, this is the problem that we have is that. And I will just point out really quickly that we have a journal that is open access, free to submit to, Journal of Global Indigeneity, that has, remarkable work. We, a couple of years ago, did a special issue, Sami issue. We focus very broadly on areas of inquiry. And we do it because we're the ones giving our labour over, so open access is never, it always has a cost, but we absorb the cost. And so understanding that and understanding, the implications of it is something that I suppose we really want people to get in weeks like this.
Great. Encia, what's your sort of perspective on the ability to participate in the open access discourse?
I gave you an example regarding the experiences that we are facing. So I think it's completely clear enough that even when you don't have any connections with your government as well, you are also facing with this kind of the limitations. So it's really complicated issue because you always saying that, okay, I'm just because you always enter science because it gives you a wings to fly, and you see that, sorry, there are many, many limitations that even if you'll be able to fly, you cannot fly, higher because they don't allow you, and you face really restrictions which are completely visible for you, but unfortunately for scientific community and for policymakers is not visible at all. And I'm also wondering that we will facing more limitations, restrictions with all these geopolitical, conflicts that they are happening more often, and the violation of the academic freedom that also has a relation with the declination of the democracy in many, many countries, because there are organizations, they are really tracing that. So of course that affects also the publications issue, which, as I mentioned, there is no real policy on that. So nobody really knows that where these rules come from, if there are any laws or not, that's the main question. Are there any rules banning specific topics, specific affiliations or countries for having access to any knowledge, whatever it is? Unfortunately, we don't have it, and I don't really know that who is really responsible for such kind of the things. UNESCO is trying to write the rules even for the academic freedom, for the open access or whatever, but the point is that none of them are laws. They are not really human rights laws, because we have human rights saying that, okay, you should have an access to education, science, and knowledge. But to be honest, that is not the case. And we see that in some countries, for example, like Afghanistan, half of the population, they don't have even right for education. So there is also no rule to really protect their rights. So that's really, really complicated issue. And I just wondering that this is the responsibility of the scientific community regarding having the access to open information, because sometimes it is not just the data that you are saying that this is restricted because of the security issues. Even if you don't want to have an access to data and resources, just the final outcome of the scientists, unfortunately, you are banned to have an access for that, which is not really, really fair. And that is the responsibility of the scientific community to stand up for their rights, saying that, okay, I publish, I do the research to give an access to everyone. And when you ban it for not publishing it, for not having access to the other colleagues, this means that you are also violating my right, because if it was in my hand, I really wanted to publish it freely, to put it in my website, whatever. So I just think that we really need the community of the scientific community to really raise these kind of the issues, that it's not just a matter of the publication cost, it is a matter that we have unwritten rules and laws that nobody really knows where it comes from, and we should stand for it, because our future generations will not really understand what caused it, and they will not have an access to the knowledge that we are created right now. So somehow we are also banning the future generation to have access to what we are creating today, which is really a big, I think, dangerous signal for all of us.
Thanks. And Heather, do you have any observations to finish?
Yeah, finding that balance between the, sort of absolute of policy and the practice in a community, I think, is where we are. And, I think we really need to think about open access not as like a finished state, right? There's not going to be a perfect everything's open or closed, but rather it's an ongoing practice that requires constant attention and negotiation. Because I think one of the things that we've been talking about today is that we want to embrace openness, but we have to be always alert to whose interests that openness serves at any given point. And that's a moving target, and it's a moving target, that requires our attention. So thinking about it as a practice on an ongoing basis is, I think, one way to think about it.
Fantastic. Well, we have actually come to the end of our time together. Clearly we could talk for quite a long time more about this, some really interesting themes and sort of threads to be sort of pulled from this discussion. I think it's been really, really valuable. I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you to our audience, and of course, thank you to our amazing presenters here today, our panelists, between Heather, Encia, Sandy, and Ksenia, thank you so much for coming, particularly for the ones who came up in the middle of the night. This is the beginning of Open Access Week. We've got a few more days left. So our next presentation from Open Access Australasia tomorrow, Wednesday, the 22nd of October, at least in Australian time, is Community Ownership, Relation, Reciprocity and Responsibility. And I'm just now going to pass to Koichi for our closing karakia.
Kia ora te whānau again. I'd like to thank again to all the panelists for sharing your knowledge and perspectives. Now it's time to calm down and get back to work or life or to bed in some part of the country. So this closing karakia is about basically cleansing our body, mind and heart. Ko tēnei te wā ki te whakamutu I tēnei kōrero. Heoi no kia ngā tātou. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ratakata. Koia rairogo, whakairi ake ki runga. Tūturu pakamawa kia tīna. Huie, taike. Thank you everyone. Have a good afternoon or evening. Thank you, Danny.